On a quiet morning, in the spring of the year 354 after Hijrah, the palace of Córdoba stirred with a gentle hum. The sun had not yet cast its full light across the marble courtyards, and dew clung softly to the petals of white jasmine that spilled over the carved stone walls. Beneath a domed ceiling painted with gold stars, in a room filled with the scent of rosewater and sandalwood, a boy was born. His mother, Lady Layla bint Umar, reclined upon silken cushions, her face still flushed from the effort of birth, her fingers wrapped delicately around the newborn's swaddled form. Outside, the fountains whispered in slow rhythm, their music a lullaby to the new soul entering the world. Servants moved quietly, trained not to disturb the serenity of the palace's most sacred moments. The midwife whispered prayers beneath her breath, praising Allah for the safe arrival of the child. They named him Abdurrahman ibn Sa'id, a name steeped in hope and remembrance. He was the grandson of an emir and the son of a noble scholar, and from the moment he first opened his eyes, his fate was entangled with the splendor and shadow of a dynasty stretching across the land like a golden tapestry. The palace into which he was born was more than stone and wood. It was a breathing thing. Its colonnades held the echoes of poetry and secrets. Its gardens were lush with pomegranate trees, almond blossoms, and the murmur of birds who had learned to mimic the calls of oud and ney. Abdurrahman's cradle was carved from cedar imported from the Levant, polished until it glowed like honey in the candlelight. A silver crescent hung above his resting place, etched with verses from the Qur'an, blessing him with peace and protection. The walls of his nursery were painted in gentle earth tones, with blue tiles from Seville lining the base like a river that circled the room. Every morning, the palace singers began their day with soft recitations, not meant for the court, but for the prince, for his ears to grow used to the flowing sounds of knowledge, beauty, and divine remembrance. As days turned into weeks, and the boy's eyes began to follow the slow dance of light through lattice screens, his mother would hum lullabies of distant deserts and green valleys, and the wet nurses would cradle him near warm fires, speaking to him softly of lions and caravans, of kings and scholars, of prayer and perfume. Even in infancy, his days were marked by rhythm, the rhythm of the palace, of prayers at dawn, of the footsteps of scholars who passed under the arches on their way to the royal library, of the wind that rustled the curtains like an old story, trying to be remembered. And so began the life of the Jasmine Prince, whose path would wind through the gardens of luxury, through the shadows of rivalry, and into the forgotten chambers of time. The seasons passed gently in Al-Andalus, and with them the boy grew. His first years were wrapped in silk and silence, in the tender whispers of women who loved him, and the distant chants of the muezzin rising above Córdoba's rooftops. He laughed before he could speak, and his laughter echoed softly through the arched halls, like a gentle bell struck in the morning light. He took his first steps in the garden of pomegranates, a hidden space within the palace, reserved only for the royal family. The earth was warm beneath his feet, and the scent of mint rose with each movement. Servants watched from a distance, hands clasped, while his mother extended her arms with patience and pride. His feet, bare and light, found the rhythm of the ground, and when he reached her, she kissed his cheeks and thanked the most merciful. By the age of 3, Abdurrahman could recite short verses from the Quran. His father, Prince Saeed, arranged for him to be taught not only in the faith, but in the refinements of the court. His first tutor was a man named Abu Khalid, a gentle scholar from Toledo, whose voice could lull the wind to sleep. He taught the boy with kindness, weaving knowledge into song, lessons into stories, and corrections into encouragement. In the cool hours after the afternoon prayer, the prince would sit beneath the colonnades, his small fingers wrapped around scrolls of fine parchment. Abu Khalid would kneel beside him, guiding his hand as he traced the letters. Curved, beautiful, mysterious, across the surface. Alif, he would whisper, like the beginning of all things, like Allah's name. And the boy would repeat it, with wonder in his voice, as though tasting the shape of the world. At night, the palace glowed with the light of oil lamps, their flickering flames reflected in brass mirrors. Music, gentle and slow, drifted through the corridors, the sound of kanun and oud, the rustle of silk robes, the laughter of distant cousins chasing each other through hidden stairwells. The prince often fell asleep to the sound of a single flute playing by the window, while his nurse stroked his hair and told him tales of Damascus, of lions who guarded desert tombs, and of stars who whispered secrets to wise men in their sleep. He dreamed of golden domes, of endless orchards, of rivers made of milk and honey, and a sky that always smelled of jasmine. Outside his chamber, Córdoba stretched wide and radiant, a city of light and thought, of marble bridges and moonlit courtyards. Its streets were swept each morning. Its people wore fine linen. Its scholars debated under orange trees, and its minarets reached high, as if to kiss the heavens. But within the palace, all was slower. Time moved like incense, curling, drifting, never rushed. The prince was not yet burdened by duty. His days were measured in cups of sweet tea, in gentle verses, in the rustle of silk garments, and in the glances of pride exchanged between mother and father. He was their son, soft, radiant, and rising. And still, the jasmine bloomed outside his window, silently, steadily, as it had since the morning he arrived. The years unfolded, like the pages of an illuminated manuscript, each one adorned with softness and learning, each one soaked in the gentle fragrance of a world made for grace. By the time Abdurrahman turned 6, the rhythms of the palace had settled into his bones. He rose with the call to prayer and washed his face with rose-scented water brought in silver basins. His tiny hands, now steady with practice, moved with reverence as he mimicked the motions of the grown men at the mosque within the palace walls. The palace was more than home. It was a sanctuary of taste and thought. With each passing year, its lessons deepened, not only in language and religion, but in the language of flowers, of gestures, of silence. Every corner held a secret, every servant an untold tale, every hall a whisper of history. Abdurrahman learned to read not only from parchment, but from faces, the bowed head of the eunuch who opened the gates, the quiet firmness of the old gardener who pruned the orange trees, the playful grace of his cousin who danced between lessons. His instructors grew in number and wisdom. From Abu Khalid, he advanced to Sheikh al-Harith, an elderly man with a beard like ivory and eyes that seemed to see centuries. The Sheikh taught him the sayings of the Prophet, "Peace be upon him. The verses of the Quran and the wisdom of the Greeks, Persians, and Indians, now lovingly translated into Arabic. He spoke slowly, gently, as though afraid his words might bruise the air. "The world is like a garden, ya Ibni," he would say, "and your heart is its soil. Tend to it with knowledge, and it will blossom with mercy." Abdurrahman listened with the stillness of one far older. He was quiet by nature, not shy, but contemplative. He would often linger beneath the palace arches, long after a lesson had ended, watching the interplay of shadow and light on the mosaic tiles, or the way the wind moved through the reeds near the fountain. His mind wandered like the Guadalquivir River, flowing steadily from the snow-capped Sierras, through fields and palaces, toward the distant sea. By now, he had his own chamber, modest by royal standards, though still adorned with carved wood and mother-of-pearl inlays. The ceiling above his bed was painted to resemble the night sky of the desert, its stars marked with gold leaf. Each night, as sleep began to press gently on his eyes, he would look upward and trace with his mind the patterns of the constellations. He was not lonely. His days were full of tutors, of cousins, of nurses, of walks through the palace gardens and rides along the river on a pony gifted to him by the emir himself. His pony was white, with eyes like polished amber, and it answered to the name Zuhair. The boy loved him dearly and spoke to him as one would to a brother. And yet there was a hush to his heart, a softness, a quiet watchfulness, as though even in youth he sensed the impermanence of the world around him. Sometimes he would climb the tower at the edge of the palace and watch the sun settle over the tiled rooftops of Córdoba, turning every dome and spire to gold. He would listen to the bells of the churches far beyond the Muslim quarter, and wonder how the sounds of different faiths could all live in the same sky. On one such evening, his mother joined him. She stood beside him in silence, her veil fluttering in the wind, her perfume delicate and familiar. "You see the world like your grandfather did," she said softly, "with eyes that do not just look, they remember." Abdurrahman did not speak. He only nodded and leaned gently into her side. And as the sky deepened from rose to violet, and the jasmine below them began to open once again, the palace settled into night. The lanterns flickered, the musicians began their soft melodies, and the voice of the muezzin rose once more, as it always had and always would, calling the faithful to peace, to prayer, and to rest. The days of Abdurrahman's boyhood began to stretch longer, like the Andalusian summer that lingered over the city, with slow warmth and golden air. By the time he reached his 9th year, his legs had grown stronger, his words more thoughtful, and his heart more curious. He was still a child, yes, but a child woven from the fabric of something older, something born of prayer and poetry, sunlight and shadow. The palace had begun to reveal more of itself to him, not just its physical spaces, but its roles, its duties, its games of silk and silence. Abdurrahman now attended select court gatherings, where his father, Prince Sayyid, sat among poets, governors, and judges, cloaked not just in robes, but in dignity. The boy would sit quietly on a cushion to his father's right, listening without speaking, watching the careful manner in which men disagreed without anger, offered praise with restraint, and chose their words as though each one might be carved in stone. The court was a place of grace, but also of performance. He began to learn the delicate pauses of courtly speech, the elegance of hand gestures, the lowering of the gaze when speaking to the elderly or the pious. His tutors now included Ustad Nabil, a master of adab, the refined conduct of princes and men of learning. Nabil was gentle but precise, correcting with a smile and guiding with a story. Through him, Abdurrahman learned the wisdom of Luqman, the poems of Al-Mutanabi, and the sharp laughter hidden inside the tales of the clever foxes and foolish kings of the East. In the mornings, he studied with the seriousness of a young scholar. In the afternoons, he wandered the palace gardens with a friend or two, a cousin named Khalid, and a quiet boy named Yahya, the son of a palace physician. They played in the garden of saffron, racing their shadows along the covered walkways, weaving between the olive trees, or floating small carved boats in the gentle current of the courtyard fountains. But even play was touched by beauty here. The gardens were no ordinary gardens. They were arranged like verses of a poem, with trees planted to bloom in harmony with the changing months, and fountains placed so their music would never interrupt one another. The birds were not caged, but lived among the branches, fat and friendly, accustomed to being sung to and gently fed. Often, Abdurrahman would pause to sit near one of the fountains, a fig in his hand, the sound of running water blending with the soft murmurs of conversation drifting from nearby balconies. The world felt eternal in those moments, as though time itself had decided to rest. As evening came, and the call to prayer echoed once more from the minarets, the palace would quiet again. Lamps were lit with cinnamon oil. Incense was burned in long-necked burners. The sounds of the oud returned like a memory, slow and tender. He would return to his chamber with dust on his sandals and sunlight in his hair, and the women of the household would welcome him with gentle hands, removing his robes, brushing his hair, placing sweet almond milk beside his bed. Then came the voice of his mother, Layla, soft as moonlight, reciting verses of the Quran as he fell into sleep. Her voice was not loud, not even meant to teach. It was a presence, like a veil of silk brushing against the soul. Her recitations flowed into his dreams, mingling with the scents of orange blossom and honeyed bread. And always, through the windows, came the wind from the hills, bearing with it the perfume of jasmine. The years turned softly, like pages in a book left open beneath a window. At 12, Abdurrahman was no longer just a child of the palace. He was a young prince now, and the air around him carried a subtle change. His robes had grown longer, the embroidery more detailed. His sandals, once simple, were now stitched with golden thread. Yet his steps remained quiet, his smile unchanged, and his eyes still watched the world with a calm curiosity that made even the older servants bow to him with warmth. His lessons deepened. What had once been stories and simple recitation now became philosophy, rhetoric, mathematics, and logic. A new tutor arrived from the East, Sheikh Abdul Qadir of Damascus, a man of piercing intellect and slow, deliberate speech. He had traveled through Baghdad, Cairo, and Fez, and he brought with him a great leather satchel filled with scrolls and dreams. The scrolls were inked in many hands, some neat, others wild, but all held knowledge that had passed through generations. Everything you see, the Sheikh told him one morning, as they walked along the palace terrace, is born from something unseen. Learn to see, not only with your eyes, but with your stillness. And so, Abdurrahman learned to observe not just what happened, but why. Why the sun warmed one wall longer than another. Why the calligrapher's hand trembled on Fridays. Why the jasmine bloomed only after twilight. He spent hours in the royal library, a vaulted hall lined with cedar shelves and latticed windows that filtered the light into soft patterns across the marble floors. There, he read by lamplight and sipped warm dates steeped in milk. The books smelled of pressed rose petals and thyme. He ran his fingers along the spines, not to select them, but to feel their stories. Beyond the world of books, he also trained his body. Swordsmanship, archery, and riding were considered arts no less noble than poetry or prayer. He trained in the courtyard of the southern wing, where polished tiles caught the sky like water. Under the watchful eye of Captain Malik, a stoic man with a falcon's gaze, Abdurrahman practiced with wooden blades, learning balance, patience, and breath. "You are not just a prince," Malik would say. "You are a promise. Move like one." And the prince did, not with the aggression of a soldier, but with the control of a dancer. His movements were fluid, measured, and precise. And when he rode Zuhair, now a strong and graceful steed, they seemed to float across the fields like two spirits from a story sung by the bards of old. Evenings took on a new rhythm. He was invited to gatherings of poets and thinkers, where old men debated under lanterns that flickered like fireflies. He spoke only when asked, but when he did, his voice was soft and thoughtful, drawing respectful silence. He asked questions, not to challenge, but to understand. And still, the music never left the palace. Oud players and flutists played songs in the corners of rooms, lit with low golden lamps. There was always sweetness in the air, from honeyed figs, from the burning of myrrh, from the gentle laughter of the women who embroidered pillows with verses of love and longing. Sometimes, in moments of quiet, he would sit by the fountains with his hands in the water, feeling the pull of time. He knew that his life was wrapped in silk and perfume, but he also sensed, in the way the wind changed direction, or the birds flew lower than usual, that life outside the palace was different, harder, colder. He would ask his father, "Why do we live in such beauty while others live without it?" And Prince Said would reply, "Because beauty is a trust, my son, and a trust must be shared, or it becomes a burden." That night, Abdurrahman lay beneath his painted ceiling, the stars above glowing faintly in the flicker of the lamp. He did not yet understand the weight of that answer, but he remembered it. And as he drifted into sleep, the scent of jasmine drifted in through the window once more, like a memory older than thought. By the time Abdurrahman reached his 15th year, the palace began to show him rooms he had never entered before, not of stone and mosaic, but of responsibility, expectation, and the silent tension that walked between the smiles of powerful men. His days, once filled with books and birdsong, began to carry the pulse of duty. It began subtly. His father, Prince Said, invited him to the majlis, not as a guest, but as an observer. The majlis was the council chamber where the nobles gathered, emirs from distant cities, judges with robes scented by ink and leather, generals marked by sun and dust. The chamber itself was large and cool, its ceiling carved in deep geometric patterns, its floor covered in soft rugs, where men sat cross-legged and spoke in careful tones. Abdurrahman listened, and he watched, not only the words, but the silence between them. He noticed how the Emir of Seville always glanced to the left before agreeing to anything, how the Qadi of Toledo cleared his throat before opposing an idea, how the Vizier never smiled with his eyes. His father said little in those meetings. He ruled with patience, letting men reveal themselves in time. But when he did speak, his voice was like still water, calm and deep, and every man leaned forward to hear him. One afternoon, after the council had ended and the nobles had departed, Abdurrahman remained seated beside his father. "You do not speak yet," his father said without looking at him. "That is good. There is more wisdom in listening than in speaking. But tell me, what did you hear today that no one said?" Abdurrahman hesitated, then replied, "That the Emir of Jaen fears something, but doesn't wish to name it." His father turned to him, surprised. "And why do you think that?" "Because his hands shook when he mentioned the trade roads, but not when he spoke of the army." Prince Said nodded slowly. "You have your grandfather's ears, and his silence. Guard both." So it began. His education turned outward. He was sent, discreetly and with honor, to observe the city beyond the palace, not in pomp, not in royal procession, but under the protection of a modest guard, dressed simply, moving like a young scholar rather than a prince. He walked the souks of Córdoba, where spice sellers shouted beneath dyed awnings, where children darted between donkey carts, where Jews and Christians haggled with Muslims, and where stories were exchanged faster than coins. He sat in the back of mosques during Friday prayers, listening to imams whose voices were thick with the dust of the world. He listened to complaints brought before local judges, watched how justice moved, sometimes swiftly, sometimes sluggishly, and began to see how delicate the balance of power truly was. He visited schools and hospitals built by the caliph's order, where scholars translated books from Greek, Syriac, and Sanskrit, and physicians treated the poor with aloe and prayer. He met orphans, taught to recite poetry before they could write their names. He saw beggars who once were soldiers, and soldiers who once were poets. And for the first time, his heart began to carry a quiet weight. That winter, a plague touched the southern farms near Algeciras. It did not reach the city, but its whispers rode the wind. The court responded. Physicians were sent, food distributed, prayers held. But even from the distance of a palace, Abdurrahman felt the sorrow. One morning, his pony Zuhair stood quiet in the stables. The keeper explained softly that the horse had grown old, and the cold had stiffened his joints. Abdurrahman sat beside him for hours, his hand resting on the animal's neck, whispering thanks for the years they had shared. When Zuhair passed in the night, the prince buried him beneath the olive trees, without ceremony, but with stillness. It was his first true grief, not sharp, not loud, but heavy, like dusk that never lifts. That night he did not sleep. He walked the palace alone, his sandals whispering against the tiles. He stopped at the fountain where he had once played as a boy. The moon was high, and the water reflected it like a second sky. His mother found him there near dawn, silent and barefoot, cloaked in his thoughts. "You feel too much," she said gently, wrapping her shawl around his shoulders. "I don't know what to do with what I feel," he replied. She smiled sadly. "You're becoming a prince." And as the adhan rose once more over the rooftops, and the jasmine opened to greet the fading stars, Abdurrahman stood quietly between the world of a boy and the path of a man, not with certainty, but with softness, and a heart beginning to understand that to rule with wisdom is to carry the sorrow of others as gently as one carries their joy. The air in Córdoba grew heavier with time, not from burden, but from knowing. By his 18th year, Abdurrahman moved through the palace with the presence of one who belonged, but also with the grace of someone who listened before speaking, who noticed more than he showed. The courtiers had begun to nod to him with a new respect, not because of his title, but because of his composure. His shoulders had broadened with the strength of training, but he still moved softly, like one who had been raised among silk. His beard, once the shadow of youth, now traced the edge of his jaw with elegance. When he sat beside his father in the majlis, the men looked at him, not as a boy, but as the voice that would one day carry the will of the court. And yet, for all his discipline, his knowledge, and his growing sense of duty, Abdurrahman's heart still wandered, not with rebellion, but with a yearning that had no name. The palace, for all its beauty, began to feel like a painting he had stared at too long. He wanted to walk past its frame. He longed to know not only how his people lived, but how they loved, how they feared, how they belonged to the land in ways no prince ever could, from behind carved wooden screens. It was during one of his quiet rides beyond the southern orchards, just outside the city walls, that he first saw her. Her name was Fatima bint Yusuf, and she was the daughter of a minor official in the Court of Records, a man known for his calligraphy and his honesty. Abdurrahman had stopped to rest beneath a fig tree, the air warm with the hum of bees and the scent of distant citrus. Fatima was with a group of women collecting herbs, her sleeves rolled up, her hands dusted with crushed mint. She was not dressed in silk. She did not wear the jewels of the court, but when she laughed at something her younger sister said, the sound of it broke gently into his chest, like a breeze through latticework. Her eyes, dark and alert, met his only for a moment before returning to her basket. He did not speak, he did not approach, but he returned the next day, and the day after that, each time beneath a different excuse, to walk, to think, to ride. She noticed, of course, but said nothing. On the fourth day, she greeted him first. "You walk often where herbs grow," she said, not looking directly at him. "And you speak where silence blooms," he replied, surprising himself. She smiled, neither shy nor bold, just present, real. What followed was not a courtship in the grand style. There were no declarations, no gifts, no public songs sung in moonlight. It was quieter than that. A conversation at the market, a shared look during Friday prayers, a rolled parchment of poetry left near a stone well. When he finally asked his father for permission to seek her hand, the palace grew still with surprise. "She is not of royal blood," Prince Said said, his tone unreadable. "But her words carry more nobility than any title I've ever known," Abdurrahman replied. There was a long silence, and then a smile, barely visible. Then let the court learn a new meaning of nobility. The wedding was held in the gardens of Madinat al-Zahra, beneath canopies of green and white. Musicians played soft melodies that rose like incense into the night. Dignitaries attended, yes, but so did scribes, merchants, and the gardeners who had once taught Abdurrahman the names of every tree in the palace. Fatima wore a dress the color of almond blossoms. She walked with calm dignity, her eyes never leaving his, and when she reached him, she whispered only, "You found me as I was. Promise you will remember me that way." And he did. Their chamber was modest by royal measure, chosen by Abdurrahman himself, facing the gardens, with doors that opened to the sound of birds and a path of jasmine petals that Fatima arranged herself. That night they did not speak much. They did not need to. They sat by the window, sharing warm dates and a bowl of pomegranate seeds. He recited a line of poetry he had written for her. She corrected his meter with a laugh. And beneath the stars, with her head resting on his shoulder and the world quiet at last, Abdurrahman knew that power was not in gold or decree, but in the softness of being truly seen. Time moved forward with the grace of a drifting veil. In the years that followed Abdurrahman's marriage, the rhythms of the palace changed, as did those of the land. He was no longer the quiet boy in silk, or the observant youth with questions in his eyes. He had become Abdurrahman ibn Sa'id al-Umawee, known across the court and beyond as Al-Aman, the trustworthy. He did not yet rule, but he was entrusted with rule. Prince Said, growing older, began to withdraw from daily matters of state, appearing only for major councils or religious feasts. The threads of governance slowly passed to Abdurrahman's hands, not with formal ceremony, but through the quiet guidance of those who recognized his mind, his fairness, and most of all, his patience. He approached rule not as a warrior or a tyrant, but as a gardener. His first acts were gentle, but deeply felt. Grain distribution to poor neighborhoods in Córdoba, reform of the palace tax policies that had burdened farmers in the northern valleys, and the rebuilding of a forgotten school in the Christian quarter that had once produced translators of ancient texts. These actions made him known not just to the court, but to the people, the men and women who tilled the soil, recited poetry in cafes, taught in dusty rooms, and stitched history into cloth. He walked among them often, never in disguise, never with fanfare, only with 2 guards and the soft authority of someone who had learned early that real power whispers. Fatima walked with him, always one step behind in public, always beside him in council. Though she bore him no sons in those early years, she bore him clarity. She listened to his doubts, shaped his thoughts, and reminded him, when ambition stirred, that greatness was a shadow easily mistaken for light. "You are a prince of jasmine and ink," she once told him, placing her hand on his chest, "not of iron." He governed from the southern wing of the palace, a place of quiet courtyards and sun-washed walls. The great audience hall, once echoing with rivalry and pride, now bore the softness of dialogue. Here, merchants spoke plainly, without fear. Judges gave verdicts free of bribes, and poets were welcomed not just to perform, but to teach. He reinstated the tradition of Al-Majlis al-Layli, the night council, where scholars, philosophers, and travelers were invited to speak beneath lantern light. There, wisdom flowed like sherbet passed in brass cups, and the prince often sat barefoot among them, his turban loose, his smile easy. But not all were pleased. Some nobles, old blood hardened by expectation, whispered in shadowed corridors. They disliked his closeness to commoners, his reforms that curbed their power, and his refusal to answer pride with pride. One, Emir Ghassan of Granada, began to gather support in the east. He claimed Abdurrahman was too soft to lead, too enamored of poetry to wield a sword. Abdurrahman did not answer him with words. Instead, he rode quietly to Granada in the middle of spring, unarmed, accompanied by only 5 men, and requested an audience before the emir and his court. The hall was tense, heavy with suspicion, yet when Abdurrahman entered, he bowed with humility and began to recite from memory a verse from the Quran. Indeed, the earth belongs to Allah. He causes to inherit it whom he wills of his servants. Then he said only, I do not rule for myself, nor for my name. I serve because I was born into service. If there is one among you better fit, let him rise now. The hall fell into stillness, and slowly, whether out of shame, fear, or awe, the nobles lowered their eyes. Ghassan, lips pressed tight, offered no challenge. Abdurrahman returned to Córdoba, not with banners, but with silence, and his people, seeing him ride through the city gates as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the white stone, knew they were led by a man who would rather win hearts than battles. Later that night, he stood on the balcony of his chamber. Fatima joined him, laying her head against his shoulder. You're too quiet, she said. I didn't come to rule, he replied, but rule came to me. And if it should ever leave? He looked out over the rooftops, where lanterns flickered like stars, drawn closer to earth. Then I will plant jasmine in its place. Years passed in stillness, yet even stillness has a sound, and Abdurrahman ibn Sa'id al-Umawee had learned to listen to it. The sounds were faint at first, a delay in grain arriving from the valley of Etija, a scribe missing from the court rolls, a merchant in the souk whispering of a new banner raised in Ronda. Nothing sharp, nothing spoken aloud, but the tone of the land had shifted, like a lute slightly out of tune. Abdurrahman remained steady. He walked the palace gardens as before. He reviewed court petitions beneath the arbor of fig trees. He met with imams, scribes, and mothers of fallen soldiers. His hand was still open, his voice still calm. But inside him, the wind had changed. It was not a revolt that threatened him, not yet. It was something quieter, a thinning of the threads that held the land together. Fewer young men answering the call to scholarship, fewer taxes sent from the mountain towns, more talk of ancient grievances, more songs sung of ancestors forgotten by the court. He summoned his most trusted advisers to a private gathering one dusk. They met not in the audience hall, but in the olive courtyard of his private wing, where no echoes clung to the walls. There sat Fatima, veiled and silent by his side. Beside her, the old vizier, Ibn Hazm, whose beard was now more silver than black. Next, the Qadi of Córdoba, 2 commanders, and finally, a poet, not for counsel, but because Abdurrahman believed poets knew truths long before judges did. I fear, he began, that our soil grows weary of the roots we planted in it. The vizier shifted. The people are restless, yes, but there is no army raised, no treaty broken. No, said Abdurrahman softly, only hearts, drifting. Fatima spoke then. Her voice was low and calm. What do you give a land that forgets it is loved? There was no answer. In the following days, Abdurrahman travelled again, not as a ruler, not even as a prince. He wore the robe of a traveller, plain and without insignia. His guards were dismissed. Only one companion joined him, a quiet man named Musa, once a slave, now a scholar of geography and human nature. They travelled by foot when they could, stopping in hamlets carved into hillsides, in crumbling villages with fountains that no longer sang. He listened. He knelt beside farmers whose hands were cracked by sun and silence. He watched young men play dice near mosques with empty courtyards, and he wept, not loudly, but with a stillness that made Musa turn away to give him privacy in his grief. When they returned to Córdoba, Abdurrahman did not call for war. He called for gardens. He issued a decree that in every town, no matter how small, a public garden be restored or planted, that fountains be repaired, that schools for girls be built beside them, that poets be paid to return to the countryside, to recite in the shade and write in the evenings by lamplight, that the people remember beauty again, and in doing so, remember belonging. Many mocked the decree. They do not need flowers, some whispered. They need iron. But the land listened, and slowly, gently, a new season bloomed, not of empire, not of triumph, but of memory. And in that quiet blooming, Abdurrahman found peace. One evening, years later, he stood alone in the western courtyard, where the jasmine was in bloom again. The moon had risen high, and the city lay silver beneath it. Fatima had gone to sleep. The court was still. The fountains murmured to themselves. He sat on the edge of the stone basin and whispered, "Let history forget my name, but let it remember my gentleness." And the wind, which had once carried whispers of unrest, now carried only the perfume of jasmine, soft, forgiving, eternal. The years had curved gently around Abdurrahman ibn Sa'id al-Umawee, like the arches of the great mosque, wide, elegant, carved by time. He was no longer young. His hair, once deep as polished walnut, had turned the colour of river stone. His face bore the soft lines of one who had smiled often and worried quietly. His voice was still measured, but now it carried the weight of silence as much as speech. By his 49th year, Abdurrahman had guided the Umayyads through a time of subtle change, not marked by battles or banners, but by shifting winds, cultural tides, slow migrations, and the tiredness of old structures trying to remain young. The court was stable, though smaller than in the time of his grandfather. The gardens still bloomed, though their caretakers were now sons of the gardeners he once played with. The halls still echoed with poetry, but the verses were simpler, less ornate, more longing. And yet, peace had endured. His name was now spoken across Al-Andalus with a kind reverence, not for conquest, not for glory, but for restraint, for mercy, for building a world that felt more like a sanctuary than a throne. At home, life had become quieter. Fatima had grown graceful in age, her presence even more soothing than in her youth. Her counsel remained his most trusted. Their bond, forged not in fire, but in stillness, had only deepened. They walked together in the evenings, slowly, hand in hand, beneath trellises of flowering vines. They spoke less now, for they had said enough. Their silence had become a second language. They had been blessed with a daughter, late in life. Her name was Ruqayya. She bore her mother's wit and her father's eyes. Abdurrahman would sit beside her while she read, tracing letters with her fingers, just as he had done as a boy with his first teacher, Abu Khalid. And when she asked him why stars moved differently each night, he smiled and told her, because they too are searching for home. In these years, succession became the quiet question that followed him like a shadow at sunset. He had nephews, wise and capable. He had advisers, loyal and learned. But he knew that power did not pass by blood alone. It passed by trust, by legacy, by readiness. He began inviting younger nobles to dine with him in the garden. He listened to them, not as a ruler, but as an elder. He watched not what they said, but how they sat. Did they interrupt? Did they listen? Did they notice the servant refilling their cup? He found promise in one, a quiet nephew named Hashim, raised by a widow in Jaén. The boy was not grand. He did not dress in gold or speak with bravado, but he carried himself with humility and looked at people, truly looked, as if he saw both their joy and their burden. Abdurrahman took him as a ward, not with titles or announcements, but with gentle presence. He mentored him in the way he had been mentored, in the gardens, at the prayer niches, beside old fountains that remembered more than any court scribe. One evening, as the wind grew cool and the sky turned a dusky lavender, Abdurrahman stood on the balcony overlooking the courtyard where he had once buried his pony, Zuhair. The tree planted there now bore small yellow fruit, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. He whispered to no one, "Let the world forget how many cities I calmed, but remember that I left the soil ready for another spring." His body had grown tired, not from illness, no fever, no wound, just a quiet fatigue that touched his bones like the setting sun touches the walls of an old house. He no longer attended court each day. Instead, he spent his time with books, with Fatima, with Ruqayya, and with the wind that passed through the screens of his chamber, like an old friend returning for one last visit. The people noticed his absence. The city grew hushed. Lanterns burned longer. The poets spoke slower. And one night, as the call to prayer echoed gently across the rooftops, and the jasmine beneath his window bloomed one final time, Abdurrahman ibn Sa'id al-Umawee, prince, gardener, listener of hearts, laid down upon his bed and did not rise again. He left no speech, no command, no final edict, only a verse written on a slip of parchment, folded beneath his pillow. Leave the earth softer than you found it, and the people lighter than they were. He was buried at dawn, beneath the olive tree in the courtyard where he had often sat with Fatima. No grand procession, only prayers, and the sound of birds singing, just as they had the morning he was born. The jasmine continued to bloom. The morning after his passing, Córdoba woke not to cries or trumpets, but to a strange stillness, as if the city itself had paused to listen for his footsteps one last time. Word spread not from messengers, but from whispers, from the baker who left his oven cold, from the calligrapher who paused with pen in hand, from the boys in the mosque courtyard who stopped playing, as though the wind had told them something sacred had shifted. Inside the palace, the halls were dimmed. No music played, no scrolls were read. The great doors of the southern garden were left open, not for guests, but to let the light in. Light he had always loved. Light that had followed him like a soft echo wherever he walked. They buried him beneath the olive tree, just as he had wished. No marble tomb, no gilded inscription, only a stone, low and plain, with one line etched by Fatima's hand. Here lies the prince who listened. The city mourned, not with chaos, but with reflection. For 40 nights, poets came to the gardens at dusk and recited verses not of conquest, but of stillness, of the way he held silence like a lantern, of the way he made a nation feel as though it were being heard. Children brought jasmine and tucked the blossoms into the cracks of the palace walls. Old men sat by the fountains and told stories of how he had once passed by their shop, paused, and asked about their sick mother, or recited a line of poetry they had written long ago. Mothers whispered his name into the ears of newborns, hoping his gentleness might live again in another child. And in the palace, Fatima remained cloaked in soft white, the color of prayer. She did not wail, she did not retreat. She walked the garden paths with her daughter by her side, showing her the trees he had planted, the stones he had moved, the letters he had written in the margins of old books. Hashim, the young ward he had mentored, was called quietly to the majlis. There, before the Qadi and the vizier, before scholars and soldiers, he was asked to speak. He rose with trembling hands. His voice was not loud, but it carried. "I do not inherit a throne," he said. "I inherit a trust, and may Allah make me worthy of even the corner of his shadow." There was no applause, only nods, only tears that glistened in the eyes of men who had never wept before. Under Hashim, the court continued, not in grandeur, but in grace. His first order was not military nor economic. It was the planting of a new garden, a public space in the heart of Córdoba, filled with shaded benches and flowing water, open to all, with a single plaque at the gate. The Jasmine Garden, in memory of Abdurrahman ibn Sa'id al-Umawee, who watered the soul of this land. Years passed, generations turned, the palace changed hands, the court shifted, the world moved on. But the jasmine still bloomed, and on quiet nights, when the wind blew from the hills and the fountains whispered in the dark, some say you could still feel his presence in the stones, not like a ghost, but like a memory that had chosen to stay behind, gentle, observing, forgiving. The city remembered him, not in the echoes of war, nor in the heights of empire, but in the soft hush before the dawn, in the way the garden turned its face to the sun, in the name of a prince who once ruled by listening. It was a quiet afternoon in Córdoba, the kind of afternoon where the shadows of olive trees stretched like thoughts left unspoken. The old man sat alone beneath the arch of a crumbling courtyard. His robes were simple. His ink-stained fingers trembled slightly as he turned the yellowed pages of the book in his lap. Around him, children chased pigeons near the fountain, and mothers spoke softly while shelling almonds into woven bowls. He was a historian, once respected, now mostly forgotten. His beard was white, and his eyes clouded at the edges, but his mind remained sharp where it mattered most. In his hands, he held a copy of a manuscript titled simply, The Life of Abdurrahman ibn Sa'id al-Umawee. He had copied it himself, years ago, from scrolls hidden deep in a private library outside Madinat al-Zahra. No one had requested it. No one had paid for it. But he felt the story needed to breathe again. He read aloud, not loudly, but gently, and only to himself. He read of the prince's birth beneath the jasmine sky. He read of his silent studies, his pony Zuhair, his mother's verses. He read of Fatima, and of gardens, and of sorrow. He read of restraint, of rule without hunger, of love without possession. He read of the moment the prince laid down for the last time, without fear, without regret. And as the old man closed the book, his fingers lingered on the final line, Leave the earth softer than you found it, and the people lighter than they were. He looked up then, toward the plaza beyond the arches. There, a young girl sat beside her grandfather, reading from a leather-bound book in slow, careful Arabic. A jasmine vine curled around the stone beside her. The old man smiled. Still blooming, he whispered. A boy passed by and asked, Who are you speaking of, sir? He looked at the boy and said, A man who once ruled this land, not with swords, but with silence, a prince of jasmine. The boy tilted his head. Did he win any wars? The old man shook his head. Only the kind you don't hear about in stories, the kind inside people. The boy nodded, unsure, and ran off. And the historian remained beneath the arch, quiet again, watching the wind stir the petals across the stones, as if the land itself remembered, gently, faithfully, the prince who once listened and made the world softer.